The road had a smell to it. Not the smell of asphalt baking under August heat, not the diesel residue of long-haul trucks that had worn grooves into Route 9's shoulder over decades of thankless transit. This was something older, something that had soaked into the clay beneath the tarmac, the way blood soaks into untreated wood, deep, permanent, invisible until the light hit it wrong. The locals knew better than to drive this stretch after dark. The ones who had forgotten that lesson were mostly forgotten themselves. Bones in a field somewhere, a shoe on a fence post, a car found running with the doors open and nothing inside but a half-eaten bag of chips and a faint smell that nobody could name, but everyone agreed they never wanted to smell again. The displacement event happened without ceremony. No portal, no light show, no dramatic column of energy descending from a cloudless sky. One moment the road was empty in both directions, flat and gray and indifferent beneath a moon that gave just enough light to make the tree line look like a jaw. The next moment, the T-800 was simply there, kneeling in the center of the southbound lane, one fist pressed against the blacktop, chrome endoskeleton fingers leaving hairline fractures in the asphalt as it absorbed the kinetic shock of materialization. The living tissue sheath across its frame steamed faintly in the night air, micro-trauma from the temporal transit already beginning to seal at the cellular level. It raised its head. Red photoreceptors swept the environment in 0.3 seconds. Threat assessment, rural highway. No vehicular traffic within sensor range. Ambient temperature 79 degrees F. Humidity 84%. Vegetation density high on both flanks, optimal concealment corridor for ambush. Population center 11.2 miles northeast. The GPS triangulation returned a location stamp that did not match any Skynet operational grid. Cross-referencing. No match found. Temporal displacement confirmed. Current mission parameters, null, recalibrating. The T-800 stood. 6 feet and 2 inches of Cyberdyne Systems combat architecture rose from the cracked highway like a monument being unveiled, the leather jacket hanging across its shoulders catching a breath of wind that smelled like pine resin and something else, something iron-sweet and biological that the olfactory sensors flagged as non-human organic matter in advanced decomposition. The flag did not trigger threat response. It triggered curiosity subroutines. Something had died nearby, something large. The tissue residue was not mammalian in any cataloged configuration. It filed the data and began walking north. The T-800 had no handler, no Sarah Connor, no John Connor, no mission directive pulling it toward a specific target with the single-minded tunnel vision that defined earlier operational deployments. What it had instead was something that the engineers at Cyberdyne had never fully intended and Skynet had never fully trusted: adaptive intelligence. The capacity to observe, assess, and generate its own operational priority structures when primary directives were absent. It had been walking for 4 minutes and 31 seconds when it found the truck. A 1978 Ford pickup pulled halfway off the shoulder, driver's door hanging open. The interior light was still on, casting a pale yellow rectangle across the gravel. On the seat, a thermos, a road map folded incorrectly, a rosary hanging from the rearview mirror, and a single work boot size 11 steel-toed, laces still tied. No body, no blood inside the cabin. Outside on the gravel, a drag pattern moving toward the tree line. The T-800 crouched over it. The pattern was not consistent with a human dragging another human. The pressure distribution was wrong. Too much weight concentrated at intervals that suggested something carrying a body vertically, pressed close to its own frame, moving fast on limbs that did not walk the way humans walked. The rosary swayed in the wind. The T-800 stood, turned toward the tree line, and waited. It waited because the olfactory data was changing. The iron-sweet smell was getting stronger, not drifting on the wind, moving, purposeful, directional. Something in those trees was circling the road, had been circling since before the T-800 arrived, most likely, drawn by the electromagnetic signature of the temporal displacement, or drawn by habit, or drawn by something older than habit, instinct refined over centuries into something so pure it barely needed a brain to execute. The first sound was wings. Not bird wings. The scale was wrong, the frequency too deep, the downstroke too powerful. Whatever was generating that sound had a wingspan that the T-800's audio processors estimated at somewhere between 14 and 18 feet. It was above the tree line now, banking in a wide arc, and the moon caught it for half a second. A silhouette so wrong, so anatomically offensive, that even the T-800's threat assessment matrix required a full 1.2 seconds to process what it was seeing and generate a response category. Unknown biological entity, flight capable, mass estimate 200–240 pounds, wing structure non-avian partially membranous, body configuration bipedal when grounded, behavioral pattern predatory surveillance, threat level recalculating. The creeper dropped from the sky the way a stone drops, fast, no wasted motion, no theater. It landed 20 feet from the T-800 in the center of the road, and the impact cracked the blacktop in a starburst pattern beneath its feet. It was tall, taller than it looked in the half-second silhouette. The coat it wore, stitched from materials the T-800's visual processors kept misidentifying, keep returning error codes on, because the base material was not fabric and not leather but something in between that smelled like both at once, hung to its knees. The hat pulled the moonlight toward it. The face beneath was a cathedral of wrong geometry, ancient and patient and hungry in a way that had nothing to do with an empty stomach and everything to do with something much older. It looked at the T-800. The T-800 looked back. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened. The wind moved. The rosary in the truck tapped against the windshield. Somewhere deep in the trees, something that had been very quiet became even quieter. The creeper tilted its head. It had done this 10,000 times, stood over prey and watched the fear bloom in their eyes like a flower opening in fast motion. Fear was information. Fear told it which parts were worth taking. The eyes of the afraid told a story about the organs behind them, the quality of the fight-or-flight chemistry, the richness of the adrenal tissue, the specific frequency of a heartbeat pushed to its absolute limit. Fear was the appetizer. The creeper had refined its reading of it across centuries of practice. The T-800 had no fear to give it. The red photoreceptors did not dilate. The heart that was not a heart did not accelerate. The body language, that primal vocabulary of hunched shoulders and backward-stepping weight distribution that every prey animal in every ecosystem on Earth defaulted to when something like the creeper looked at them, was entirely absent. The machine stood the way a wall stands, upright, still, unimpressed. The creeper made a sound, low, resonant, somewhere in the chest, a sound that had made grown men drop to their knees and weep without understanding why. A sound tuned by evolution to vibrate at the exact frequency of human dread. The T-800's audio processors logged it as non-linguistic vocalization, possible intimidation behavior, ineffective. It raised its right arm, and the plasma rifle that had survived the temporal displacement materialized from beneath the jacket. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. The plasma bolt hit the creeper in the chest at a velocity that should have ended the conversation permanently. It didn't. The discharge carved a hole through the ancient coat, through the layered biological armor beneath it, through what passed for a sternum in a creature that had been redesigning its own skeleton for longer than most civilizations had been keeping records. The impact threw the creeper backward 12 feet, boots leaving twin skid marks across the cracked blacktop before it collided with the Ford pickup hard enough to cave the passenger door inward and flip the vehicle onto its side. The rosary swung one final arc and went still. The thermos rolled out and into the ditch. The T-800 was already advancing, recalibrating threat assessment in real time, cataloging the ballistic data. Entry wound confirmed. Penetration depth, sufficient for organ disruption in any known biological target. Projected lethality window, immediate. The creeper stood up. Not slowly. Not with the labored mechanics of something badly wounded pulling itself upright through sheer stubbornness. It stood the way a tree stands after a strong wind passes, with the calm, indifferent authority of something that has never genuinely believed it could be put down. The hole in its chest was already closing, not healing in the way human tissue heals, no gradual cellular regeneration, no scarring process, but reconstructing, the edges of the wound pulling toward each other with a wet architectural precision, new tissue weaving itself into the gap like fingers lacing together. In 11 seconds, the wound was gone. In 15, the coat had somehow incorporated the damage into its existing patchwork, the burned edges blending into the surrounding material as though the bolt had simply become part of the garment's history. The T-800 processed this. It had encountered resilient targets before. The T-1000 liquid metal, effectively immune to conventional ballistic trauma, requiring either extreme temperature differentials or structural dissolution to neutralize. This was not that. This was biological. Genuinely biological, the sensors confirmed organic chemistry, cellular activity, metabolic function. But the regenerative rate was operating outside every parameter in the T-800's database. The closest analog it could generate was theoretical, a self-repairing system with redundant biological architecture, no single point of failure, damage response time measured in seconds rather than days. New tactical protocol required. The creeper charged. It moved the way large predators move when they stop performing and start working, low center of gravity, arms out, covering the 20 feet between them in a time that the T-800's motion processors clocked at 0.8 seconds. The impact was significant. 110 kilograms of Cyberdyne combat chassis met 220 pounds of ancient predatory biology, and the collision produced a sound like a car accident at low speed, that dense, metallic organic crunch of two things that were not supposed to meeting anyway. The T-800 was driven back 6 feet, boots grinding into the asphalt, leaving parallel furrows in the road surface. It absorbed the kinetic data, recalibrated its footing, and drove its elbow into the side of the creeper's head with 1,400 foot-pounds of force. The creeper's head snapped sideways, the hat came off. What was underneath was not improved by visibility. The face, if face was even the operative word for that arrangement of ancient, scarred geometry, turned back toward the T-800 with an expression that was not pain and not surprise but something that might have been, for the first time in a very long time, genuine interest. The creeper reached up and touched the side of its own skull where the blow had landed. The bone had fractured. It was already reknitting. But the creature held its own head for a moment in a way that suggested the sensation. Not pain, exactly, but pressure, impact, the acknowledgement of force was novel enough to deserve a second of attention. The T-800 pressed the advantage. It dropped the plasma rifle. The charged cells were not rated for extended regenerative targets, burning through power at an unsustainable rate, and shifted to direct mechanical engagement. 2 strikes to the thoracic region, testing structural response. 1 to the left knee joint, assessing mobility limitation potential. A grip on the right arm, pulling, calculating the tensile threshold of the creeper's connective tissue. The data was coming in fast, and it was all painting the same picture. This organism had no reliable kill switch. Every system was redundant. Every point of failure had a backup. You could not bleed it out. You could not break it down through cumulative damage at any rate the T-800 could sustain. The math was not in its favor through conventional engagement. The creeper threw it. Not a punch, a throw, the full rotation of its body behind the motion, catching the T-800 by the jacket and releasing it in an arc that sent the machine 40 feet through the air before it came down through the tree line, splintering 2 pines on the way to the ground. The forest floor absorbed the impact badly. The T-800 left a crater. It lay still for 1.4 seconds, diagnostic running, and then sat up. Living tissue sheath, 23% compromised on left side. Endoskeleton intact, hydraulic pressure nominal, combat capability undiminished. It stood and walked back to the road. The creeper was waiting. It had retrieved its hat. It stood in the center of the highway with its head tilted at that same angle it had used at the beginning, that reading posture, that assessment mode. But the data it was receiving now was clearly not matching any template it carried. The T-800 watched it process. The creature moved slowly around the machine's position, circling, staying just outside direct engagement range, and the T-800 recognized the behavior immediately because it was the same behavior it used itself when encountering an unknown threat profile. The creeper was gathering intelligence. It was smart, that mattered. The T-800 ran a secondary analysis on the biological data it had collected during the grapple. Physical contact had provided significantly richer sensor data than visual observation, tissue density, temperature distribution, electromagnetic field generated by the creature's nervous system, the specific chemical signature of whatever passed for adrenaline in its biology. One data point stood out sharply from all the others. The creeper's body temperature was wrong. Not uniformly wrong, there were zones of normal biological heat distribution across the torso, the limbs, the areas where regeneration was actively occurring. But in the chest cavity behind the sternum, in a rough sphere approximately 8 inches in diameter, the temperature was dramatically lower. Not room temperature, lower than that. Lower than anything biological had any right to be. The T-800 flagged it, cross-referenced with regenerative behavior, cross-referenced with the speed and precision of tissue reconstruction, generated a hypothesis. The regeneration was not systemic. It was sourced. Whatever was in that chest cavity was driving the process, feeding it, coordinating it, acting as the central mechanism for everything that made the creeper functionally unkillable. The rest of the biology was impressive. The rest of the biology was ancient and layered and formidable, but the rest of the biology was downstream of that cold point in the chest. Find that, destroy that. The creeper stopped circling. It had reached its own conclusion about something. That much was readable in the shift of its posture, the way its weight settled into a different distribution, the way its hands, those ancient, scarred instruments, opened slightly at its sides. It had decided the T-800 was not prey. The machine had no fear to read, no adrenal chemistry to taste in the air, no softness anywhere in its biology. The creeper had harvested eyes and hearts and lungs and vocal cords, and the specific architecture of a spine from a man who had run 6 miles before it caught him. It had never encountered anything it couldn't find a use for. The T-800 had nothing it wanted. That should have ended the engagement. That should have been the creeper's cue to spread those vast, wrong wings and return to whatever feeding ground it had abandoned to investigate the electromagnetic anomaly of the displacement event. It had a cycle to complete. It had needs that a machine could not satisfy. The rational predatory calculus pointed clearly toward disengagement. The creeper did not disengage. Because something else had entered the equation, something that the centuries of feeding and killing and rebuilding itself piece by piece from the bodies of the worthy had never introduced to its psychology before. The T-800 had hurt it, not damaged it permanently, not threatened its survival. But the elbow strike had landed with enough force to fracture ancient bone, and the creature was standing in the road rolling that sensation around in whatever served it for a mind, and the conclusion it was arriving at was not fear and not retreat. It was fascination. And in the creeper's long, blood-soaked history, fascination had only ever led to one thing. It wanted what the machine had. The T-800 saw the shift in posture, logged it, generated a new threat assessment parameter it had never needed before. Target is not attempting to feed. Target is attempting to acquire. Threat level escalating. The machine set its feet. The cold point in the creeper's chest pulsed once, invisible, undetectable by any human sense, but bright and clear on the T-800's thermal array. Both of them understood, in whatever way each of them understood anything, that the next phase of this engagement was going to be different. The town of Poinsett had exactly the kind of relationship with Route 9 that small towns develop with dangerous things over generations, a mixture of superstition, denial, and a carefully maintained public silence that everybody understood without anybody ever articulating. You didn't talk about what happened on that road. You didn't drive it after dark if you had sense. You didn't ask too many questions about the missing persons, reports that the county sheriff's office filed with a regularity that any outside observer would have found deeply alarming, but that the locals had long since absorbed into the background noise of their lives, the way people who live near train tracks stop hearing the trains. Sheriff Dale Hodges had stopped filing the reports with any expectation of response 7 years ago. He was 54 years old, had been sheriff of Poinsett County for 11 of those years, and had developed a set of operational protocols for the stretch of Route 9 between mile marker 4 and mile marker 19 that bore no resemblance to anything taught at the Law Enforcement Academy in Tallahassee. Don't send deputies out there alone. Don't respond to calls from that corridor after sunset without waiting for daylight. Don't look too hard at the evidence. Don't let the state boys get involved. They'd either get killed or they'd start asking questions that would unravel the particular social contract that kept Poinsett functioning as a community rather than a ghost town with a zip code. He was on his third cup of coffee at 2:17 a.m. when the call came in. Lena Marsh, dispatcher, 26 years old and sufficiently new to the job that she still had the reflex to treat every call as potentially solvable, put the report through with the careful neutral voice she used when the content of what she was saying and the voice she was saying it in were doing very different things. 2 callers, independent, both on Route 9, both reporting the same thing, a figure in the road large, not moving, not responding to headlights. One caller described it as a man in a leather jacket. The other caller, who had gotten closer before revering at speed and not stopping until he reached the Sunoco station on County Road 7, described something that Dale chose not to repeat to Lena because she had a good life ahead of her, and there was no reason to populate it with that particular image. Dale put down the coffee cup, picked up his radio, told Deputy Carver to meet him at the junction of Route 9 and Miller Creek Road and to bring the truck with the auxiliary lights. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out the folder. It was not an official folder. It had no case number. It contained photocopies of articles from 4 different states, printed from a university database by someone who was no longer employed at the Poinsett County Sheriff's Office, a deputy named Reyes who had lasted 8 months before submitting her resignation with a 2-line letter that said only that she had accepted a position elsewhere and wished the department well. What she had actually done was drive to Gainesville and spend 3 weeks talking to a professor in the Department of Folklore and Anthropology named Dr. Cecil Armand, and what she had left in Dale's desk before she left was everything she had found. Dale had read it 17 times. The folder described something called the Banished Angel, a pre-colonial entity documented in oral traditions across 6 distinct indigenous cultures spanning from the Gulf Coast to the Ohio River Valley. The convergence of independent accounts across that geographic and cultural range was, according to Dr. Armand's margin notes, statistically and anthropologically extraordinary. The entity fed in cycles. It harvested biological material. It was not killable by any method documented in any account, though several traditions described methods of interruption, ways to break the cycle, delay the feeding, drive it dormant. None of the methods described were available to a county sheriff with a budget that barely covered fuel costs. What the folder did not describe, what no oral tradition, no academic paper, no margin note had ever anticipated, was what happened when the entity encountered something that was not alive in any biological sense, and was not afraid in any psychological sense, and was currently, according to the second caller's breathless account, engaged in what sounded like a sustained physical confrontation with the entity in the middle of the southbound lane. Dale drove to the junction. Dr. Cecile Armand had not been sleeping when her phone rang, because Dr. Cecile Armand almost never slept on nights when the atmospheric pressure dropped below a certain threshold, and the humidity climbed above 80%, which were, by her own long observation, the nights when the accounts clustered. 22 years of research had given her a sensitivity to conditions that she could not have defended in a peer-reviewed journal, but that had kept her alive on 3 separate occasions when less attuned researchers had not come home from fieldwork. She answered on the second ring. The voice on the other end was not one she recognized, but the information it relayed was detailed enough and specific enough that she was already pulling on her boots before the call ended. The caller identified himself only as a graduate student working under a professor at a private research institution she had never heard of, the Sommerfield Institute for Anomalous Biological Studies, headquartered, apparently, in a location the caller declined to specify. He told her that their monitoring equipment had detected a temporal displacement event on Route 9 at 1:58 a.m. He told her that the entity she had spent 22 years studying was currently engaged with the displaced object. He told her that the institute had a vehicle 2 hours out, and that they were extending her a professional courtesy by calling ahead. Professional courtesy. She wrote it down. It was the kind of language people used when they wanted to sound collaborative while making sure you understood that the collaboration had a hierarchy and you were not at the top of it. She did not care about the hierarchy. She packed her field kit, her recording equipment, the worn leather journal that contained 22 years of observations, and a device that looked like an oversized television remote, and that she had built herself over the course of 3 years from components sourced across 5 countries. She had never had occasion to use it in the field. She had tested it twice in controlled conditions in her garage in Gainesville, and both times it had produced results consistent with her theoretical model. Whether those results would scale to field conditions, in proximity to the actual entity, she did not know. She got in her car and drove north. Route 9 at 3 a.m. was a different geography than Route 9 at any other hour. The darkness was not simply the absence of light. It had texture and weight, pressed down by the canopy of live oaks that arched over the road in the middle stretches, their Spanish moss hanging motionless in the humidity like something that had given up on movement altogether. Dale's truck crawled along the center line with both spotlights running, Deputy Carver riding the passenger window with his hand on his sidearm, in the way people hold weapons when they know the weapon is not the point, but having something to hold makes the breathing easier. They found the overturned Ford pickup first. Dale stopped the truck and sat for a moment, engine running, looking at the vehicle. The way it was lying, caved door, the ground around it disturbed in a pattern that suggested impact rather than roll, told him something large had hit it, or it had hit something large at speed. But the drag marks he could see in the headlights, leading from the truck's original position toward the tree line, told a different story, and it was a story he recognized from 7 years of carefully not looking at evidence. Carver started to open his door. "Stay in the truck," Dale said. He said it quietly and without drama, and Carver, who was 29 and knew enough to still bristle at being managed but old enough to read tone, stayed in the truck. The sound reached them before the figures resolved out of the darkness ahead, a deep rhythmic impact, metal on something that was not metal but was taking the hits with a solidity that concrete would have envied. Dale eased the truck forward. The spotlight swept the road ahead and caught them both in the same frame. The T-800 had the creeper by the coat, driving it repeatedly into the road surface with a mechanical efficiency that was almost hypnotic. Not rage, not desperation, but systematic. Testing. The creeper was absorbing each impact and responding with those vast arms, tearing at the machine's living tissue sheath in strips, exposing the chrome endoskeleton beneath in widening patches that caught the spotlight and threw it back cold and sharp. Neither of them stopped when the lights hit them. Neither of them registered the truck's presence at all. Carver made a sound that was not a word. Dale put the truck in reverse and drove back to the junction, where he stopped and sat with his hands on the wheel and breathed carefully and thought about Dr. Cecil Armand's folder and the margin note she had written on the last page in red ink. What defeats it will not be human, has never been human. The traditions are unanimous on this point. His radio crackled. An unfamiliar voice, calm and precisely modulated, identifying itself as the Summerfield Institute and requesting the sheriff's department establish a perimeter and hold position. Dale looked at the radio for a long time. Then he picked it up and asked what the Summerfield Institute planned to do about the two things currently destroying his county road. The pause before the answer was exactly long enough to tell him that they didn't know yet. The Summerfield Institute's vehicle was a black Ford Expedition with government-adjacent plates that didn't match any state registry Dale had access to, and it arrived at the Route 9 junction at 4:11 a.m. with the quiet confidence of an organization that had never needed to explain itself to local law enforcement and didn't intend to start now. 3 people got out. 2 were large, moved with military economy, and wore tactical gear that had the look of equipment designed by someone who had studied standard military loadouts and then made specific modifications based on knowledge the military didn't have. The third was a woman in her late 40s, compact and deliberate in her movements, carrying a leather journal under one arm and a device that looked like nothing Dale had a category for. She walked directly to Dale's truck and looked at him through the window with eyes that had the particular quality of someone who had been surprised by very little for a very long time. "You're Hodges," she said. It was not a question. "You're Armand," he said, also not a question. He had read her name in the folder enough times that it had the weight of familiarity. She nodded once, the compact acknowledgement of someone who preferred action to social friction. "How long have they been engaged?" "Since before my callers spotted them. Best estimate 2 hours plus." Something moved across her face, not surprise but recalibration. She opened the journal, found a page dense with notations, and made a new entry with a pen she produced from her jacket pocket without looking for it. 2 hours, she repeated, writing. "It hasn't broken off." "No. It always breaks off." She said it to the journal more than to Dale. "Every documented engagement with a resistant target, and there are 11 across the recorded accounts, it breaks off within 20 minutes, reassesses, finds a better angle. It doesn't sustain." "It's sustaining now." She looked up from the journal and toward the darkness down Route 9, where the sounds of impact were still reaching them on the warm, heavy air, that rhythmic mechanical percussion overlaid with something lower and more organic. The creeper's responses, its attempts to reorient the engagement on its own terms. "Because it hasn't solved it yet," she said. "It's still in assessment mode. The feeding instinct is secondary to the acquisition instinct right now." She paused. "That's new. That's genuinely new." What Armand knew, and what the Summerfield Institute's 2 tactical personnel, she thought of them as Reyes and Cole, though those were not their actual names, and she had stopped asking for actual names 3 postings ago, did not fully appreciate despite their considerable practical experience, was that the creeper's psychology was not simple predatory hunger. That was the common misread. That was what got people killed who thought they understood what they were dealing with. The hunger was real, and the hunger was ancient, and the hunger drove the cycle. But underneath the hunger was something older still, a collector's compulsion, a taxonomist's instinct, an entity that had been cataloging biological excellence for so long that the cataloging had become as fundamental to its identity as the feeding. It didn't just want to eat, it wanted to keep the best parts. And the T-800 had something it had never encountered in 2,000 years of hunting, a structural framework that operated at biological efficiency levels without being biological. The endoskeleton it had been exposing strip by strip through the ongoing assault was not bone, but it performed the functions of bone with a precision that the creeper's harvesting instinct was reading as extraordinary. The hydraulic musculature was not muscle, but it was doing what muscle did at a level of mechanical perfection that the ancient entity's acquisitive mind was processing as desirable in ways it didn't have language for. It wanted the machine's skeleton. Armin had worked this out 40 minutes into her drive north, reviewing her notes on the acquisition behavior patterns, cross-referencing with the caller's description of the ongoing engagement. The creeper wasn't fighting the T-800 the way it fought resistant prey. It was fighting it the way it fought worthy prey, with the specific, focused intensity it reserved for targets it had already decided it was going to incorporate. The difference was subtle but critical. Against resistant prey, it was tactical and disengaged. Against worthy prey, it was committed. The tactical problem this created was significant. A disengaged creeper could be redirected. Its attention could be manipulated, its cycle interrupted through environmental intervention, the specific methods documented in 3 of the indigenous traditions she had studied: salt-based compound barriers, low-frequency acoustic disruption, particular chemical combinations that interfered with its sensory apparatus. None of those methods were designed for a committed creeper. A committed creeper was going to finish what it had decided to finish, and the only variable was what finishing looked like. The device she had built, the one that looked like an oversized television remote, was not a weapon. She wanted to be precise about that in her own mind because the distinction mattered philosophically as well as practically. It was a disruption instrument. It generated a specific electromagnetic pulse pattern based on the frequency analysis she had conducted on recordings of the creeper's own biological field emissions, a kind of mirror signal designed to create interference at the neurological level, not damage, not destruction, but confusion. A few seconds of sensory interruption. Enough, in theory, to break a committed engagement long enough for an alternative outcome to assert itself. She had never tested it on the actual entity. She was about to. The T-800 had been running the same tactical problem for 97 minutes and had generated 43 distinct approach variations, each one tested against the data it had accumulated from the engagement, each one returning the same fundamental conclusion. The creeper could not be neutralized through cumulative damage at any rate the machine could sustain. The regenerative mechanism was too fast. The biological redundancy was too comprehensive. The plasma rifle was depleted. Direct mechanical engagement was producing quantifiable damage that the entity was simply absorbing and rebuilding on a cycle that the T-800 could not outpace. The cold point in the chest. 43 variations all converged on the same terminal objective. The cold point was the source of the regenerative process. Destroy the cold point and the redundancy collapsed. The T-800 had reached this conclusion 40 minutes ago and had spent the intervening time working toward a position where it could access that point, which required getting through the creeper's guard at close range and driving sufficient force into the chest cavity to reach a depth of approximately 14 inches, which was where the thermal sensors placed the anomaly. The problem was that the creeper was not cooperating with this objective. It was strong, genuinely, remarkably strong, stronger than the T-800 had calibrated for in its initial assessment, and the T-800 had calibrated high. The thing had spent centuries in close-quarters combat with every variety of resistant prey the human species had produced, and it had incorporated not just their biology but their fighting knowledge, the specific neuromuscular patterns of people who had fought back hard before the end. harvested nerve clusters and motor cortex tissue that had given it an intuitive grasp of human combat mechanics that no purely instinctual predator should have possessed. It read attacks before they fully committed. It repositioned with a fluency that was not animal and not human, but something synthesized from both. The T-800 adapted. It stopped attacking linearly, started introducing false commitment patterns, initiating attack vectors it had no intention of completing, reading the creeper's anticipatory response, using the data to map its defensive instincts. 3 feints. 4. The ancient entity was learning the machine's patterns at the same rate the machine was learning its, both of them locked in a mutual intelligence-gathering exercise wrapped in the packaging of a fight, each one building a model of the other with every exchange. The creeper was faster than the T-800's initial projection. The T-800 was stronger than the creeper's initial assessment. They had been, for the last 20 minutes, approximately matched, and that approximate match was the most dangerous thing either of them had encountered, because it meant the engagement had no natural resolution point. It would not end through one party's incapacitation. It would end through one party finding an angle the other had not modeled. The spotlight hit them both at 4:23 a.m., brighter than Dale's truck spots, military-grade illumination from the Sommerfield vehicle, positioned 200 meters down the road. The T-800 registered it and dismissed it as environmentally irrelevant. The creeper registered it differently. Light had meaning for the creeper that went beyond simple visibility. The accounts Armen had studied described a specific aversion response to certain light frequencies, not incapacitation but irritation, a sensory interference that degraded its focus slightly but measurably. The creeper turned its head toward the light for 1.3 seconds. The T-800 did not waste 1.3 seconds. It drove forward, inside the creeper's guard, both arms committed to the chest cavity, fingers finding the gap between the layered biological armor plates at the sternum that the ongoing damage had opened over the course of the engagement. 14 inches. The cold point was 14 inches in, and the T-800's arm was inside the creeper's chest up to the elbow before the entity's response caught up with what was happening. And what the T-800's thermal sensors found at the end of that reach was not what it had projected. Not a discrete organ, not a gland or a node or any biological structure it had a category for. A void, a cold, structured void, geometrically precise, approximately spherical, generating a field that the T-800's sensors could measure but not characterize, not biological, not mechanical, not any energy configuration in the machine's database. Something that existed at the intersection of biology and something else entirely, something that the creeper had not grown or developed or harvested, but had arrived with, carried since before any of the traditions that documented its existence had begun keeping records. The creeper's reaction was immediate and total. Every ounce of its ancient, focused, acquisitive patience evaporated. What replaced it was something the T-800's behavioral analysis matrix had no clean label for, not rage, not fear, not the committed hunting intensity it had been operating under for the past 2 hours. Something more fundamental, something that lived below psychology, below instinct, at the level of absolute self-preservation that only activates when the thing being threatened is not the body, but whatever the body exists to protect. It tore the T-800 off the ground with both arms and threw it with everything it had. The machine traveled 90 feet and went through the tree line like a projectile, and the sound of its impact carried back to the road clearly enough that Dale, standing by his truck 200 meters away, flinched at it. The creeper stood in the road with its chest cavity partially exposed, the void briefly visible in the spotlights, a sphere of absolute cold darkness in the middle of all that ancient, reconstructing biology, and it screamed. Not a hunting sound, not an intimidation vocalization. Something older and rower than either. Armand raised her device and activated it. The device worked. For 4 seconds. The creeper's scream cut off mid-frequency as the electromagnetic pulse found the resonant match Armand had spent 3 years calculating, the mirror signal hitting the entity's neurological field like a tuning fork pressed against its exact opposite pitch. Its body locked, not paralysis in any conventional sense, not a shutdown of motor function, but a full system interrupt, every process from regeneration to sensory processing to the deep acquisitive intelligence that drove its decision-making going momentarily offline the way a power grid goes offline when the frequency drops below tolerance. It stood in the road with its arms at its sides and its ruined chest exposed, and the void at its center pooling cold light into the humid night air, and for 4 seconds it was simply still. Armand counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then the creeper shook itself like a wet animal shedding water, and every system came back online simultaneously, and it turned toward the source of the disruption with an attention that was different from anything it had directed at the T-800, not acquisitive, not fascinated, but recognizing. The way a very old and very dangerous thing looks at the one person in the room who actually knows what it is. Armand held her ground. Behind her, Reyes had a weapon raised, a modified launcher loaded with a compound Armand had formulated based on the acoustic disruption methods from the Seminole oral traditions, suspended in a delivery medium that would disperse it across a 30-foot radius. It would not stop the creeper. She had been explicit with both tactical personnel about that before they left the vehicle. Nothing in her research suggested anything stopped it permanently. What the compound would do was degrade its sensory processing for an estimated 90 seconds, blunt its ability to track, to assess, to execute with the surgical precision it preferred. 90 seconds of compromised hunting capability. She had built the entire plan around those 90 seconds. The problem was that the plan had assumed the T-800 would be functional and in position when those 90 seconds began. From somewhere in the tree line came the sound of something large and mechanical working its way back toward the road, the deliberate, unhurried progress of a system that did not feel urgency, the way biological systems felt it, but that had assessed the situation and determined that returning to the engagement was the operationally correct response. The T-800 was not fast right now. The throw had been catastrophic in terms of structural damage. Dale could see, as it emerged from the tree line into the edge of the spotlights, that the living tissue sheath was gone from the left side entirely, the chrome endoskeleton fully exposed from shoulder to hip, one-leg hydraulic system compromised enough to produce a slight but visible asymmetry in its gait. The red photoreceptors were both operational. The chassis was upright. It was enough. The T-800 processed the scene in the 1.1 seconds it took to fully clear the tree line. Armand's device, the creeper's momentary interruption, the tactical personnel with the launcher, the sheriff's truck 200 meters back, the exposed void in the creeper's chest, still visible, the regeneration slower than it had been earlier in the engagement, the repeated damage to the chest cavity over 2+ hours having taxed even the creeper's extraordinary reconstruction capability. The T-800 generated a new operational priority structure in 0.3 seconds. The void was accessible. The window was closing. It did not run. The hydraulic compromise in the left leg made running a secondary efficiency risk. It walked, fast and direct, the chrome endoskeleton catching the spotlights and throwing them back in cold fragments across the road surface, and the creeper turned from Armand to the machine with the smooth, total reorientation of something that had been briefly distracted returning to what actually mattered. Now Armand said. Reyes fired. The compound hit the creeper from behind and above, dispersing across its back and shoulders and the exposed back of its head in a fine aerosol that found the sensory organs, those ancient, refined instruments that had been reading prey for centuries, and introduced approximately 47 distinct interference signals simultaneously. The effect was not dramatic. The creeper did not stagger or cry out. Its movements simply became slightly less fluid, its tracking slightly less precise, its anticipatory response slightly slower. A degradation that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 2 hours watching it operate at full capacity. The T-800 had spent 2 hours watching it operate at full capacity. It knew exactly what the degradation looked like, and exactly what it meant. It closed the remaining distance in 4 seconds and drove both arms into the creeper's chest. What happened next was not a fight. It was a contest between two absolutes, the machine's mechanical commitment to reaching the void and the creeper's biological and psychological commitment to preventing that. And around them, the night held its breath with the specific stillness of a world that understood it was witnessing something that would not happen again. The creeper tore at the endoskeleton with both hands, finding gaps in the chassis plating, pulling at the hydraulic lines and sensor clusters with the focused desperation of an entity that, for the first time in its existence, understood what losing felt like in principle, even if it had never experienced it in practice. Chrome components rained onto the blacktop. The T-800's left arm lost full mobility at the elbow joint. The right arm kept going. 14 inches. Armand was running the countdown in her head, 60 seconds of disruption remaining. The creeper's sensory interference was already partially compensating. She could see it in the way its movements were recovering their precision, the ancient neurology routing around the interference the way water routes around an obstacle. 50 seconds. The tactical personnel had no second shot. The compound took 12 minutes to reconstitute in the delivery system. 40 seconds. The T-800's right hand found the void. Not metaphorically, not approximately. The thermal sensors confirmed contact with the field boundary of the cold sphere, and what the machine found there, what its haptic sensors transmitted back up the damaged arm to the combat AI still running full diagnostics in the damaged chassis, was a surface. Not biological, not mechanical. A surface with the specific electromagnetic resistance of something that had been made rather than grown, made by a process, and according to a design that the T-800's entire database could not source, could not date, could not categorize. It applied pressure. The creeper's response was unlike anything the preceding 2 hours had produced. Every wound it had sustained across the engagement had been met with reconstruction, immediate, efficient, almost contemptuous in its speed. This was different. This was the entity's entire biological system revering priority, abandoning every other process, pulling every resource from every redundant system toward a single objective, protecting the void. The regeneration at the chest cavity accelerated to a rate Armand had never documented and privately had not believed possible. Tissue constructing itself around the T-800's arm in real time, trying to entomb it, slow it, redirect it away from the sphere at the center of everything. 30 seconds. The machine was losing the arm. The tissue growth was compromising the joint systems progressively, and the hydraulic pressure required to maintain position against both the biological encroachment and the creeper's physical resistance was exceeding the damaged system's capacity. The combat AI ran the projection, full arm loss in approximately 19 seconds. Sufficient force maintained for approximately 11 of those seconds before the pressure at the void contact point fell below the threshold required to produce structural effect. 11 seconds. The T-800 did not hesitate, because hesitation was not in its architecture. It redirected every available hydraulic resource in the entire chassis, mobility, postural stability, sensory system power allocation, everything into the right arm. The leg hydraulics failed completely. The T-800 went to one knee on the blacktop. Several sensor clusters went dark. The photoreceptors dimmed to emergency power levels, the red glow fading toward amber. Everything the machine had, focused to a single point for 11 seconds. The void cracked. Not shattered, not collapsed. A crack, a single fracture line running across the surface of the sphere in a direction that had no geometric logic Armand could identify, following some internal structural stress point that only became visible at the moment of its failure. Through the crack came light, not the cold, dark pulsing the void had been producing, but something else, something warm and deeply wrong, the light of a process that had been sealed inside that sphere for longer than the traditions that documented the creeper's existence had been old. The smell that came with it was indescribable. Armand would spend 3 years trying to find language for it, and would eventually settle on the inadequate shorthand of ancient, not old, not decayed, but ancient in the way that certain deep geological formations are ancient, carrying the specific atmospheric signature of a time before the present arrangement of the world. The creeper made a sound that was not the scream from earlier. That had been anger and violated self-preservation. This was something underneath anger, something that lived at the foundational level of whatever the entity was, whatever it had been before the centuries of feeding and harvesting and rebuilding had constructed the thing that haunted Route 9. A sound of genuine, absolute loss. It released the T-800. Not tactically, not as part of any combat calculation. It simply let go, stepped back, and stood in the road looking at its own chest with the specific stillness of something that has just understood that the world has changed in a way that cannot be unchanged. The crack in the void was spreading slowly, the warm, wrong light leaking out in thin lines across the chest cavity, the regenerative tissue around it behaving strangely, not rebuilding, not reconstructing, but growing in confused patterns, responding to a signal that was no longer giving clear instructions. The T-800 was on one knee, right arm entombed to the mid-forearm in biological material, chassis running on emergency power, most mobility systems offline. It had reached the void. It had cracked it. The projection for completing the fracture, driving sufficient additional force to collapse the sphere entirely, required resources the machine no longer had. It ran the numbers 3 times. 3 times the answer was the same. It had done everything it could do. Armand was already moving. She had built the device for disruption, not destruction. But the disruption instrument had a secondary mode, one she had included in the original design based on a theoretical model she had never expected to need, a mode that inverted the mirror signal. Instead of matching the creeper's biological field frequency, it would push against it, amplify the interference rather than create resonance. She had thought of it as a failsafe, a last resort function for a scenario she had considered academically impossible. She armed it. Reyes grabbed her arm. "Doctor." "The crack is propagating," she said. "If the sphere loses structural integrity on its own timeline, it could take hours, days. We don't know what the release event looks like at full collapse, and I am not prepared to find out empirically in a populated county." Reyes released her arm. Armand walked to within 15 feet of the creeper. It looked at her. Those ancient eyes, above that ruined geometry of a face, with the void light leaking through the chest cavity behind them casting strange shadows upward. It looked at her the way it had looked at her from the road when she had first activated the device. Recognizing, evaluating. And now, underneath those familiar registers, something she had spent 22 years believing she would never see in any documented account of this entity. Uncertainty. "I know what you are," she said, not to provoke, not as bravado, because it was the only honest thing to say to something this old, and honesty felt like the only currency worth spending. The creeper regarded her for 3 seconds. Then it looked at the T-800, still on one knee in the road, amber photoreceptors tracking, the chrome chassis glinting under the spotlights like something recovered from a depth where light had never reached. Then it spread its wings. The downstroke was enormous, that 14 to 18-foot span generating a pressure wave that Armand had to lean into, her hair horizontal, the journal pressed hard against her chest. The creeper rose from Route 9 in a single powerful stroke and climbed into the dark above the tree line, and the warm, wrong light from the cracked void pulsed once as it cleared the canopy, and then it was gone, absorbed into the August night. The sound of those wings fatting south, with the specific diminishing quality of something that has decided to go somewhere else without deciding anything about what happens next. Silence. Dale, 200 meters back, realized he had been holding his breath for what felt like several minutes. He let it out. Carver said something very quiet that Dale chose not to acknowledge. The radio on the dash crackled once and went silent. Armand lowered the device, made a notation in the journal. Her hand was steady. She had worked too long and seen too much for her hand to be anything else. But the steadiness cost her something she would feel for several days afterward in ways she would not discuss with the Sommerfield personnel. The T-800 raised its head. Amber photoreceptors found Armand. The combat AI ran a threat assessment on every entity in the current environment and returned the same result it had been returning since the creeper's departure. No immediate threat detected. It began the slow process of rerouting hydraulic resources back to mobility systems. The arm was still entombed. That would require mechanical intervention it could not perform unassisted. It looked at the road where the creeper had stood, processed the residual thermal data from the void. The crack was still propagating slowly on a timeline that confirmed Armand's assessment. Hours, possibly days. The collapse event, when it came, would release something. The T-800 did not have a category for what, neither did anyone else present. Armand crouched in front of the machine and studied the exposed endoskeleton with an expression that was professionally controlled and personally overwhelming. "You found the core," she said. The T-800 looked at her, confirmed. "Do you know what it is?" A pause that was not uncertainty but thorough processing. "No." She nodded slowly. "Neither do I." She opened the journal to a fresh page. "But we're going to need to be here when it opens." Down Route 9, to the south, the sound of wings was gone. But the night was not the same night it had been before they started. Something had shifted in the specific way that things shift when a process that has been running uninterrupted for centuries encounters its first genuine variable and does not know yet what to do with it. The creeper was not gone. It was never gone. But it was different now, carrying something damaged at its center, flying on a cycle it could not complete in the way it had always completed it, and somewhere in that ancient and alien psychology working through a question it had never needed to ask before. What happens when the thing you cannot kill cracks the thing that makes you unkillable? The void light pulsed faintly from the empty road, warm, wrong, patient. Route 9 held its breath and waited to find out.